Hi, I'm Mike Hudson, and this is the Museum of the American Printing House for the Blind. This month we're talking about tactile books, the history of the first books meant to be read with your hands rather than with your eyes. Of course, today people who are blind or visually impaired use Braille, but back in the day, Braille had not been invented yet. The guy who gets all this going is Dr. Valentin Oui. He founds the first school for blind children in 1784. He has one student, Francois Lesueur. Francois and Dr. Oui get together and figure out that Francois can feel the embossed letters on fancy envelopes that Dr. Oui gets. Sometimes he's invited to fancy soirees over at the royal court. Francois can feel it. That gives Oui the idea to cast special type, come up with an embossing process to press the letters into the page, and thus you get the first book for blind readers. This is the Essay on Education for the Blind. Soon starts spreading around the world and gives people in other countries ideas of their own. The font that Oui used in his book was a pretty fancy, highly serifed font. Today we tend to use non-serif fonts for low vision readers, and it turns out that non-serif fonts are also useful for people who are reading with their fingers. The first guy that we know that came up with this was a guy named John Alston. He was a Scot who was teaching at a school for the blind in Edinburgh, and John Alston comes up with what was called Alston type. It was basically all capital letters. In the United States later, a similar version was called Philadelphia line. But there were also people who were experimenting with non-alphabetic codes. The first was an Englishman named Thomas Lucas. And Lucas used, instead of using shapes like the letters of the alphabet, he used all sorts of curves and lines, and then he would put raised dots or commas together with the shapes, trying to come up with symbols that were easier to distinguish one from the other than the letters of the alphabet. Another guy who comes up with kind of a similar thing, but it's kind of a compromise between those two ideas, is an Englishman named William Moon. And Moon's shapes might be similar to alphabetic letters. For instance, his capital A looks a lot like a capital A, but without the horizontal crossbar. But sometimes his letters didn't look anything like the alphabetic letters. For instance, his H actually looks like a circle. Moon type happens to be an interesting version because there are people reading Moon type even into the 21st century, and only recently has the Royal National Institute for the Blind discontinued its Moon type. And then there's the last font I want to talk about, and that's what's called Boston line letter. Now, it was invented by a guy named Samuel Gridley Howe up at the Perkins School in Boston. It was the first school for blind kids here in the United States. And Howe wanted a font that was very angular. He also was dealing with the problem of not being able to make the descenders on letters like G and J. And so all of Howe's Boston line letter symbols are very angular. He didn't have any capital letters. Instead, like for G and P and Y, those letters with descenders, he would use the capital letter version of that. And all of that came into a big, massive debate across the world, really, about what the best font was for blind readers. And we'll talk about that in another post.